Dry Creek Hollow wasn't much of a town. It sat in a shallow basin between bald hills, a cluster of sun-bleached buildings leaning against the wind like tired old men. The sky above was the color of spent gunmetal, heavy with storm promise, and the wind carried the scent of dust and dying grass. There'd been no proper rain in months, and when it came now, it would wash more than mud from the streets. Matthew Kane rode in slow, his hat low against the gathering clouds. His coat, once black, was faded to the color of burnt coffee and worn smooth at the cuffs. A Winchester carbine hung across his saddle, its stock dulled by years of calloused hands. The horse beneath him was a rangy sorrel, ribs faintly showing, its mane thick with burrs. No one came to greet him. The town's single main street was lined with sagging storefronts, the dry goods, a shuttered schoolhouse, a half-empty livery bar, and a saloon whose crooked sign swung like a hanged man in the wind. Windows flickered with faint lamplight. Faces appeared in them like half-remembered ghosts, peering through curtains and cracked glass, before vanishing back into the gloom. Matthew was a stranger here, though his face might have belonged to any dozen hard men who'd passed this way before. The sort with too many miles behind them and too little ahead. He dismounted outside the saloon, the horse snorting wearily. A few men leaned against the rail, their clothes stained with sweat and dust, eyes flat with the same quiet malice you found in dying places. One spat tobacco juice into the mud. "That's him," someone murmured. The words carried, thin as smoke. Inside the saloon, the piano stood silent. A single bottle clinked against a glass. No one laughed. It wasn't Kane they spoke of. Not truly. Word traveled faster than hoofbeats in Dry Creek Hollow, and the wind had carried an uglier tale. A girl, Clara Mercy, widow's daughter, preacher's granddaughter, barefoot and hollow-eyed, digging through kitchen refuse behind the saloon like a stray cur. Some said she spoke to herself. Some said she snarled. A few claimed they'd seen her crouched among the dogs behind Judge Thompson's place, gnawing a bone meant for a mongrel. Once, they called her Sweet Clara. After her mother's death, they called her nothing at all. Kane knew these towns. They bled a person slow, stripped them to bone and shame. He didn't ask the names of the men watching him now. Their type wore faces like old boot leather and counted cruelty as coin. He moved on, past the chapel, where a lone grave stood apart from the rest, marker leaning like a drunken sentinel. Miriam Mercy, beloved wife and mother. The earth around it was cracked, flowers long withered to brown stalks. No one had knelt there in months. Kane's fingers brushed the Winchester stock. The storm was closer now, low thunder murmuring like some old god clearing his throat. By dusk, the rain came thick, cold sheets pounding the dust into dark paste. Lamps glowed behind crooked shutters. The town shrank back into itself, leaving the alleys and yards to shadows and strays. It was in one of those alleys he found her. She crouched in the mud beside a splintered barrel, sleeves torn to rags, hair hanging in a matted curtain over her face. The dogs around her were mutts, ribs sharp beneath mangy fur, their eyes glassy in the rain. One snarled weakly as Kane approached, then whimpered and slunk back. The girl held a scrap of bread, or what might have once been bread, blackened and sour with mold. She gnawed at it with small, cracked teeth, her movements twitchy animal. Mudcake her bare feet. Kane crouched, rain dripping from his hat brim. He unslung a piece of salted venison from his coat pocket, its surface cured hard but clean. He set it on the ground between them. The girl stilled, her eyes lifted, pale, hollow things in the flickering lamplight. Not blue, not gray, a color you'd find in the heart of winter ash. There was no recognition in them, only wariness, and something else. The stubborn spark of a creature too starved to hope, too hurt to surrender. Kane said nothing for a long while. The rain tapped against rusted tin above them. A dog nosed closer, sniffed the meat, and retreated. Then, his voice rough and low, like gravel under a wagon wheel. "She eats beside me now." It wasn't a request. Not to the girl. Not to whatever cold thing might be watching from the dark windows and corners of this place. Clara Mercy flinched at the words, as if struck. She stared, and something unreadable flickered in her face. Without a word, Kane rose. He turned, not waiting to see if she followed. Behind him, the venison vanished from the ground with a soundless swipe of a small, dirt-smeared hand. The wind shifted. Somewhere a door creaked open. The saloon sign groaned. Dry Creek Hollow remained what it had always been, a place where dignity died quiet and slow. But that night, in one rain-soaked alley, something shifted. A promise made in the language of the dying and the damned. "She eats beside me now." And so she did. The blacksmith's shack sat on the far edge of town, where the land gave way to open scrub and brittle grass. It had been empty for years, the smith long dead, his anvil rusting beneath a lean-to half swallowed by weeds. The roof sagged in places, and the walls bore the stains of 100 storms, but it stood, and it was dry, and that was enough for Cain. The storm followed them, a dark ceiling of clouds spilling rain in ragged curtains. Thunder rolled overhead like distant artillery, and the wind sighed through the dead trees beyond the fence line. Cain pushed open the warped door with a shoulder, its hinges crying out. Inside, the scent of old ash, cold iron, and oiled leather clung to the air. A pile of firewood sat by the hearth, his work from the day before, and beside it, a pile of discarded horseshoes and rusted tools. The place was bare but for a cot, a chair, and a battered iron stove. Clara stepped inside like a shadow. She didn't look at him, nor at the room. She moved to the far corner and folded herself there, knees drawn tight, arms wrapped around a tattered shawl the color of dead leaves. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands, clinging to her hollow cheeks. The rain struck the windows in ceaseless rhythm, streaking the glass like the tracks of weeping faces. Through faded curtains, the world beyond blurred into gray. Cain set about stoking the fire. He stacked dry kindling and coaxed a flame with steady hands. The orange glow pushed back the chill, sending long shadows dancing across the walls. He hung a kettle of rainwater to boil, the old metal hissing as it met the heat. In the corner, Clara flinched at the crack of wood settling. Her eyes flicked from wall to door to window, as if tracking things only she could see. At every knock of wind against the boards, her shoulders tensed. Cain watched her for a long moment. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition. Once, years ago, a little girl had clung to him the same way, skin fever-hot, hair damp with sweat, her breath shallow and quick. He'd ridden through 2 days of blizzard to fetch a doctor who never made it. By the time Cain returned, the child was cold, her small hand still clutching the edge of his coat, where he'd left her. That winter had buried both his daughter and his wife in the same patch of frozen earth. Afterward, there'd been no reason to stay anywhere. So he didn't. He became a man who arrived in places without a name to offer, with only his rifle and the weight of unspoken grief. Until tonight, the storm clawed at the roof, wind howling like some old, wounded thing. Cain poured 2 cups of coffee, so thick it clung to the tin, setting one by Clara's side. She didn't touch it. He didn't expect her to. He moved about the room in silence, laying out his rifle for cleaning, lighting a second lantern. The fire's warmth began to stretch into the corners, chasing back the worst of the damp. An old comb rested atop a crate by the hearth. Cain took it, turned it in his hand. The wood was splintered, teeth uneven. Without a word, he crossed the room and knelt beside her. Clara stiffened at his nearness, eyes wide, breath shallow. She looked as though she might bolt, but her hunger, exhaustion, and whatever small piece of her still believed in mercy kept her still. Cain lifted a strand of her hair, dark as storm water. Mud and knots clung to it. Gently, slowly, he began to work the comb through the worst of it. Neither spoke. The fire cracked, a log shifting. The rain's voice on the windows softened to a steady whisper. Outside, the last light had gone from the sky. He worked in silence, each stroke careful. He knew better than to speak platitudes or ask useless questions. Words had a way of shattering fragile things. Clara's breathing slowed, though she didn't look at him. The lines in her brow eased, and the set of her mouth softened from something tight and bitter to something merely hollow. Cain found a length of frayed ribbon on the table, old, sun-bleached red, and gathered her hair into a loose braid. It wasn't neat. It didn't need to be. The kettle rattled against the hook, steam ghosting into the room. Thunder grumbled in the distance like some old cannon, firing across forgotten battlefields. He finished the braid and set the comb down. Clara spoke then, voice barely more than a scrape of breath. "Why?" The word hung between them. Cain rested his arms on his knees, staring into the fire. The flames threw his shadow long against the far wall, making him look larger than any man should. "Because," he said, voice rough as river stones, "someone should have." He didn't need to explain who. She understood. They sat like that, side by side in a quiet made softer by firelight. Outside, the storm slowly passed, and the night grew still. Inside the blacksmith shack, for the first time in many months, Clara Mercy slept. By morning, the storm had passed, but the town of Dry Creek Hollow wore the night's damage like old bruises. Rainwater pooled in wagon ruts, shingles clung loose from rooftops, and the air hung thick with the clean, sharp scent of wet earth. And already the word had spread. By the time Cain crossed the street to fetch water from a well, folk had taken to their corners, like coyotes scenting blood. The widow Elsby clutched her apron against her chest and crossed to the other side of the road. The stable boys whispered behind cupped hands. Even the preacher, gray-bearded and trembling, pretended not to see him pass. It wasn't just about the girl. It was about what a man was willing to carry. In towns like Dry Creek, decency was currency, and no one liked a man who spent it too freely. Sheriff Wes Crowley found Cain at the livery, squinting against the rising sun. Crowley was a man shrunk by his position, skin weathered like old canvas, eyes lined with years of making peace where no peace could last. "You don't know what you've done," Crowley said without preamble. Cain led his sorrel to the trough. "Seems plain enough to me." Crowley sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "This town don't forget, Cain. Folks here carry their grudges like grave markers. You taken that girl, well, you might as well have spit in every one of their coffee cups." Cain glanced over, his face unreadable. "She ain't done them harm. Don't matter. Folks need a target. Been that way since the mines dried up and the cattlemen started circling wagons. You can't fix what folk don't want mended." Cain didn't reply. There wasn't anything worth saying. Crowley looked like he wanted to say more, but the weight of old failures hung in the air between them. Finally, the sheriff tipped his hat and walked away. By dusk, a new face had arrived. Elias Vaughan rode in with the storm behind him, a long-limbed man in a dust-colored duster, his hat low, eyes like twin bullet holes in a sun-creased face, his mouth curled in a permanent smirk, one corner higher than the other. He carried no badge, but men like Vaughan didn't need one. The town could smell what he was. Word came fast. Vaughan was hired by Clem Raddock, the cattle baron whose money owned half the valley and whose thirst for control owned the rest. Officially, Vaughan was here to settle debts. Unofficially, to see trouble buried before it took root. Cain felt the stir of something old, something he'd thought buried beneath years and miles. He remembered the name, and more than the name. The night before Cold Creek, rifles flashing in the dark, men screaming for their mothers as they bled out on winter soil. Vaughan had been there, a man who shot for the wrong side of any line. And Vaughan remembered him. They passed each other on the street at sundown, neither slowing. Just a flicker in Vaughan's expression, recognition, and something like dark amusement. Later that night, the storm returned. The clouds gathered again, thick as wool, lightning stitching crooked seams across the horizon. Rain spat against rooftops. The town's lamps glimmered behind curtains. Clara slipped from the blacksmith's shack into the thickening dusk, drawn by the restless weight in her chest. She moved like a wraith, barefoot in the mud, shawl clutched tight. The chapel stood at the town's edge, its windows black, its bell long since fallen silent. She stood beneath its eaves, the storm catching in her hair, watching the sky. That's where Vaughan found her. He came from the shadows, with the easy gait of a man too long accustomed to bad things. A smear of rain slicked his face. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look at the gutter bitch standin', like she's worth Savannah." Clara stiffened. She didn't run, though every bone in her urged it. Her gaze darted, searching the dark. Vaughan stepped closer, voice like oil on water. "Don't figure I seen dogs eatin' at a man's table before, though I reckon every town's got its own kind of filth." His hand reached out. Not a strike, Something worse, the promise of it. And then Kane was there. He stepped from the shadows, a part of them, rifle slung over one shoulder, hat brim low. Rain traced silver lines down his face. Vorn's hand froze inches from Clara's cheek. Neither spoke. The storm grumbled overhead, a long, deep growl. Kane didn't draw. He didn't have to. The way he stood, the way the wind pressed his coat against the shape of the Winchester, said enough. Vorn grinned, teeth yellow in the lantern glow. "Well now," he said softly, "ain't this a picture? Soldier boy, playing shepherd. Thought you'd be dead by now, Kane." Kane's voice was a dry scrape of gravel. "Not yet." A long moment hung there, tight as a drawn wire. The town might have held its breath if it had the courage. Vorn chuckled, spat into the mud, and let his hand drop. "No sense in killing the dead twice. I'll see you around, old dog." He turned, disappearing into the wet dark. Kane waited until the sound of his boots faded. Then he looked at Clara, rain clinging to her lashes. "Back to the shack," he said. She went, and this time she didn't look over her shoulder. And though the storm followed them home, the town, for the first time in years, knew someone had drawn a line no man crossed. Not if they meant to live. Days turned to a kind of uneasy rhythm in Dry Creek Hollow. Not peace. Not friendship. Just the fragile accord of two people too wounded to leave and too stubborn to fall. Matthew Kane spent his mornings splitting wood and setting fence posts out by the north pasture, where a dry creek bed marked the edge of a property nobody else wanted. His hands, scarred and cracked, worked with the steady patience of a man who'd known harder labors. He mended rusted hinges, set a door straight on its frame, oiled the old stove. The blacksmith shack slowly changed, not in appearance, but in the way it breathed, less a tomb, more a shelter. Inside, Clara learned the old, cautious cadences of a house not truly her own. She swept the hearth clean of ash, brewed coffee thick enough to stand spoon in, and sometimes stood at the window watching dust swirl in the empty yard. The dogs lingered still, half-wild things drawn by habit. She fed them table scraps without meeting their eyes. A few times a week, Kane left coins on the table without speaking. She never took them, and neither mentioned it. At night, the fire crackled in the hearth. Kane sat with his rifle across his knees, cleaning it by lamplight. Clara sat by the window, listening to the wind hum through the cracks in the boards. Now and then she'd hum a tune, thin as thread, the words long since lost. Half lullaby, half funeral song. The tension between them hung in the air like storm weight, too quiet to name, too heavy to ignore. Clara carried a fear she could not voice, one born from months of cruelty, from the clench of calloused hands and the sharpness of words meant to strip flesh from spirit. She waited for Kane to change, for the kindness to sour, because it always did. Kane, for his part, wrestled with old habits. Silence was his armor, distance his only refuge. He knew how men looked at girls like Clara. He'd seen the way pity curdled into possession. He would not be that man. But some days, the weight of shared grief, of a face in firelight not his own, pulled at the loose thread of his resolve. Then came the snow. It fell without warning one late afternoon, thick white flakes that drifted from a slate-gray sky, catching on the bare limbs of cottonwoods and coating the brittle grass in hush. The air sharpened, the scent of frost cutting through wood smoke. Kane came back from the fence line with his collar turned up, tools slung over one shoulder. He found Clara in the yard, barefoot in the snow. She stood still as a grave marker, the wind knotting her hair around her shoulders. In her hand she held a bundle of faded fabric, ivory once, now the color of old parchment. An old wedding dress, its lace eaten by time, the seams frayed and yellowed. The snow gathered in her hair like scattered white petals. She didn't seem to feel the cold. Kane stopped a few paces away. His voice, when it came, was softer than he meant it to be. "You'll freeze out here." Clara didn't move. She stared at the dress, her thumbs brushing over the brittle satin. Her voice was a pale ghost. "I was meant for a kinder life." The words weren't a plea, nor a complaint. Just a truth, laid down like a card in an unwinnable hand. Kane looked at her a long moment. Snow gathered on his hat brim, melted against the heat of his skin. So was I, he said. And that was all. No false comforts. No soft assurances neither of them believed. Just a shared acknowledgment of how the world took things it had no right to, and left you to carry what remained. Clara's shoulders eased, the tightness in her jaw loosening. She didn't look at him, but she turned toward the cabin. Kane followed. That night, the shack felt warmer, though neither spoke of it. The fire burned long. The dogs lay curled beneath the table, and the wind outside sang low through the eaves. Clara set 2 cups of coffee by the fire, without being asked. Kane nodded, and for the first time, she did not flinch when he passed near. They spoke little. The silence between them had grown familiar, no longer sharp-edged, but something else. The tension still lived there, but it had softened at the corners. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was closer than either had known in years. The night came heavy and mean. A sickle moon hung pale above Dry Creek Hollow, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and sour whiskey. Lamps flickered in windows, and restless horses stamped in their stalls. Somewhere a dog howled, sharp and lonesome. Matthew Kane sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. The metal gleamed dull in the lamplight. The click of brass against wood steady and sure. Clara moved about the cabin in measured steps, hair braided down her back, the fire's glow catching the copper in its strands. Neither spoke much, but something had shifted in the days since the snow. The silence between them no longer threatened to suffocate. It filled the spaces like smoke, a quiet companion. Then the shouting started. Kane stiffened, eyes narrowing as voices rose outside. Angry voices. A man's barked orders, the rough edge of liquor in their tones, the unmistakable timbre of a mob gathering strength. Clara's hand went to the hearth poker, knuckles white. Kane rose, slinging the Winchester across his shoulder. He checked the chamber with the ease of a man who'd done it too often. "Stay behind me," he said. The sound of boots on dirt came next, rough and many. A flicker of torchlight through the slats of the shack's window. He stepped out into the night. A dozen men, maybe more, had gathered in the clearing. Some held torches, others pistols. Faces twisted with drink and the ugly righteousness small towns wore when they believed they had the numbers. Familiar faces, the stable hand, the storekeep, even the gray-bearded preacher, his expression lost and sunken. And at their center, Elias Vorn. The gunman's coat hung open, a bottle dangling from one hand. His eyes shone fever-bright, the sick grin of a man who'd been spoiling for this. "Well, hell," Vorn crowed, voice thick with drink. "Look who comes crawling out of his hole. Soldier boy, clinging to his charity whore." Clara appeared at Kane's side before he could stop her, pale but steady, her braid damp from the evening mist. The torchlight painted her face in gold and shadow, and though her hands trembled, her gaze did not waver. Vorn laughed at the sight of her. "There she is. Dog's got herself a master now. Took you long enough, Kane. I was betting you'd bleed out like the last coward you left behind." Crowley pushed through the throng then, his face drawn and old in the flickering light. His badge caught the fire's glow, but the town had outgrown its fear of it. "Enough, Vorn," the sheriff said. "This don't need doing that." Vorn waved the bottle in lazy circles. "Shut your damn mouth, Wes. Man keeps filth like that. Town's got a duty." Someone in the crowd murmured agreement. Another spat into the dirt. Kane stepped forward, rifle cradled but ready. "She's under my roof," he said, voice carrying like iron through the night air. "You don't get to lay a hand on her." Vorn sneered. "You defending a whore, Kane. You fighting for what's left of your sorry pride." Kane's gaze swept the faces before him. Men he'd seen sharpening plows, fixing shutters, now turned mean by fear, by drink, by the rotten courage of numbers. "Then let's see which of you's ready to die over a woman you spit on," Kane said, leveling the Winchester. A long, taut silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The rifle's barrel gleamed, steady as a church bell. No one moved. Crowley, eyes rimmed in something too close to shame, stepped beside Kane. His hand hovered over the butt of his revolver, not drawn, but there. A few men looked away. The stable hand dropped his gaze. The preacher fumbled at his collar. The fire's heat seemed to dim. Vorn's grin faltered. "Bunch of cowards," he snarled. She's filth, and you're worse for keeping her." But no one stepped forward. The mob, brave in numbers, bled apart. Men muttered excuses. Someone dropped a torch, its flame guttering in the dirt. One by one, they drifted back into the dark, the weight of Kane's rifle and Crowley's stare pressing them down like an unseen hand. Vorn spat into the dust. "This ain't done," he hissed. He turned and disappeared into the night, the shadows swallowing him whole. When it was over, the clearing was empty but for Kane, Crowley, and Clara. The sheriff let out a long, unsteady breath. "You'll be hearing from Raddock for this, and you'll wish it was just the likes of Vorn." "I'm not moving," Kane said. Crowley gave a tired nod, as if he hadn't expected anything else. He left them to the quiet. Kane lowered his rifle. The fire crackled in the distance. The dog circled warily at the edge of the yard. Clara sagged against the doorframe, not from fear, not this time, but from the unsteady weight of a life she thought long lost. A life where someone might choose to stand, and in the soft dark, with no one to see. She wept, not for what had happened, but because someone, at last, had said no on her behalf. Kane said nothing. He left the door open as he went back inside, and Clara followed. Dawn came cold and gray, the snow a soft quilt over Dry Creek Hollow, smoothing the ugliness of the night before. The world felt still, as though it, too, waited to see how this final act would unfold. Matthew Kane knew before the knock of crows took to the sky that Vorn would come. Men like Elias Vorn didn't leave grudges to fester. They saw them through, blood and bone and dirt. And Kane was done running from old debts. He left Clara, sleeping by the dying fire, a stray lock of hair across her brow. In the night, she'd begun to hum again, a thin sound somewhere between a prayer and a lullaby. Kane took his rifle and walked out into the morning hush. The river crossing sat a mile out, where the banks curled like old hands around the slow water. Snow clung to the reeds. Mist hung low. The world smelled of wet earth and iron. Vorn was waiting. His horse, black as spilled ink, pawed at the earth. Vorn stood beside it, hat low, coat unbuttoned, the cruel set of his mouth already smiling. "Could have left, Kane," he called across the frostbitten space. "Could have taken your mongrel girl and gone." Kane said nothing. "You were always too proud to crawl, even with a bullet in you. Guess it's time we finish what Cold Creek started." Kane leveled his rifle. Vorn's hand twitched for his Colt. The crack of the shot shattered the quiet. Pain bloomed hot in Kane's shoulder, spinning him back a half-step. But his own bullet found its mark, a clean, merciful shot through the heart. Vorn's face showed a flicker of surprise before his knees buckled and the snow drank his blood, without judgment. The earth made no sound as it claimed another cruel man. Kane staggered, the cold wrapping around him tighter than any wound. He pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder, gritting his teeth. He left Vorn where he fell. The walk back to the shack took what felt like half his life. The snow blurred his vision, blood smearing across his coat. Clara met him at the door. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch. She simply took his unsteady weight beneath her arm and guided him inside. The fire was gone to coals, but she stoked it to life with dry splinters, her face set and pale. Without a word, she fetched the old wedding dress, yellowed and brittle, the lace stained with time. She tore it into strips with steady fingers, the sound of fabric ripping loud in the hush. She bound his wound, hands careful but unflinching. The dress, a relic of another woman's sorrow, found purpose in mending. When she was done, she set his rifle within reach and knelt by the hearth. Kane watched the snow gathering on the windowpane. The world felt distant, but her presence anchored him. By noon, Sheriff Crowley came. He didn't knock. He stood in the doorway, a folded paper in one hand. His face held that same worn sorrow, but something softer now. "Guess no one will challenge you now," he said. He tossed the deed onto the table. "Land's yours. Shack 2. Raddock's men are pulling out. Town's quiet." Kane met his gaze. "I didn't do it for the land." Crowley gave a thin, knowing smile. "I know." And then, without another word, he left them to their silence. In the days after, the town shifted. A basket of eggs appeared on the porch one morning, no name left. The preacher's wife, silent and gray, left a jar of preserves. A small girl with fire-colored hair waved shyly from a doorway. Nothing was said, but the weight in the air grew lighter, day by day. Snow fell still, but softer. When Cain could ride again, he saddled the sorrel, packed what little they owned, and turned toward the hills. Clara rode beside him. They made for the old Mercy homestead, what was left of it. The house stood in ruin, walls sagging, windows gone, but the hearthstone still solid, the chimney reaching up like a crooked finger to the sky. They made a fire in its remains. Night fell heavy with stars, and by that fire, with the wind in the grass, Cain spoke of things long buried, of a wife with hair the color of autumn leaves, of a daughter lost to fever's cruel hand, of the man he'd become afterward, hollowed out and drifting. Clara spoke of her mother's songs, of nights spent praying not for salvation, but for an end, of the way voices could cut sharper than knives, and how every kindness since had felt like another trap. They didn't speak of love. They promised presence. "You eat beside me now," Cain said, the old words carrying new weight. Clara's eyes shimmered in the firelight. She nodded, and in the silence that followed, it was enough. The snow fell quiet around them, softening the jagged edges of the world. The fire burned steady, and in that place of ruin and ash, two people who had survived not to forget, but to endure, sat side by side as the long night settled in.